Thank you, and good morning. I'm honored to deliver this paper in this great city of Oxford, where Methodism emerged, and also at Lincoln College, where John Wesley was a fellow. Yesterday, I wandered around the city. I went to Wesley Memorial Methodist Church, and in the introductory pamphlet, I found, Hugh Price Hughes was the former superintendent of Oxford Circuit. And I was wondering, I have put myself in a spot by criticizing him a little bit on this paper. Um, I thank the organizers for accepting this proposal. And also I thank all the previous presenters, Leslie for painting a picture of how missionaries had to navigate different circumstances in different countries. And Yuan for asking this question, is coffee morning part of mission? Maybe connecting these two things, my paper is going to look at the missionary controversy of 1889 to 90. 4 articles published by Dr. Henry Loon in April 1889 in the Methodist Times stirred up a major controversy and shook the British Methodist world in 1889 to 90. These articles criticized the general missionary policy of Wesleyan Methodist Society and the lifestyle of missionaries in India. The discontent among the Methodist public was further fueled by the endorsement of these articles by the popular leader of Forward Movement and former superintendent Hugh Price Hughes, and the halfpenny weekly paper, The Joyful News. This controversy brought the income of the missionary society down to the lowest it had been for 40 years. In this paper, I will describe this controversy, which is largely forgotten in the contemporary mission studies, and analyze the issues surrounding the educational mission, which was questioned by these articles. I will argue that while the charge had validity and merit, it did not take into account the circumstances and long-term implications of such strategy. Now, Henry Loon, who later became Sir Henry Simpson Loon, was a 29-year-old medical missionary who came to India in 1887. He was stationed for a year in Thiruvarur, which was about 18 miles from my hometown, Manargudi. He spent most of that 1 year, he was in India struggling with health, and he traveled to Madras, now Chennai, several times for treatment. During his travels, he met and interacted with educated Indians, politicians involved in Indian freedom movement, and missionaries from various missions. In April 1888, he stayed for some time at Madras Christian College, which is still a prestigious Christian institution in India. And finally, after a year, on 19th November 1888, he returned to England because of his continuing ill health. But his brief stay in India and the encounters he had left him with strong negative impression of the educational mission. Now, on his return from India, he began to work with Hugh Price Hughes in the West London mission. Hugh encouraged him to write a series of articles for the Methodist Times titled A New Missionary Policy for India. Now, he wrote these 4 articles. Try democratic methods, the evils of a false position, the untrodden via media, the secret of missionary finance. Let me briefly summarize it. The first article argued for a change in mission strategy, accusing the Wesleyan Missionary Society of spending a disproportionate amount of time and resources on educating Brahmins, the high caste or the priestly class of Indian society, who in turn used their education to attack Christianity. In the second article, Lund claimed that this focus on educating Brahmins had contributed to a missionary lifestyle that has alienated the masses. And in the third, he proposed a middle ground that involving reducing missionary stipend and encouraging them to live among the indigenous population. Finally, in the last article, he advised the Wesleyan Missionary Society on how to engage with the British public to inform them of the work in the field and also to raise money for the mission. Now, these articles provoked strong reactions both from the British Methodist public, who withdrew their subscription from the society, and from missionaries in India, who responded to these charges in different platforms. Critics of the missionaries used these articles to bolster their case in Indian newspapers. An article by one William Digby appeared in the Hindu, a prominent Indian newspaper, criticizing the missionaries' lifestyle. Missionaries reported that even in school oratory competition, a student was using phrases taken from these articles to talk about the missionaries. In November 1889, the Indian missionaries passed a resolution asking the Home Committee to appoint a commission to investigate the evidence on which those charges were made. The missionaries in India felt that in the annual conference of the Methodist Church held in July of that year, they had simply yielded to the threat of Mr. Hughes to resign and sent them, the Indian missionaries, a message of love, confidence, and sympathy. Because at that time, Methodist Church didn't want this controversy to blow up. So they said, let's just settle it. But because of this request from India, a committee was formed, and the Indian missionaries were represented by Reverend W.H. Finlay, brother of George Finlay, who wrote 5-volume work on Methodist Mission Society. Then the director of Wesleyan College at Nagapatnam, and Professor George Patterson, a Wesleyan missionary teaching at Madras Christian College. This committee met from 27th to 30th May 1890 and heard arguments from both sides, interviewed independent witnesses who lived in India, and concluded that the charges against the missionaries were unfounded, but asked the conference to pay missionaries in Indian silver, that is rupees, than in British gold. Now, the case against educational mission. Dr. Loon's original intention was to talk about the educational mission with particular focus on higher education, that is secondary and tertiary education. He did this in his first article. However, this subject got lost in the controversy that arose over his comments on the lifestyle of the missionaries in subsequent articles, which he claimed was a magnificent lifestyle using the offerings of the British middle class. In this paper, I will concentrate solely on the question of education, leaving the question of missionary lifestyle for another time. Now, Loon had two accusations. One is he was criticizing Alexander Duff's policy, and secondly, he was telling this was an advantage to Brahmins, not to the masses. In his first article, Loon criticized the undue emphasis placed on educating Brahmins while neglecting the work of evangelism. He blamed the great Scottish missionary Alexander Duff, who pioneered the educational mission in India. Now, Alexander Duff was credited with overhauling the Indian educational system by making English as a medium of education. But for Loon, Duff who was 24 when he landed in Calcutta, made a hasty decision to focus on education rather than direct evangelism. He did it in order to distinguish himself from others before him. For Loon, this was a mistake, and all other missionary organizations followed this method without much thought. He argued that although Brahmins, the priestly class, they made up less than 4% of the total population, they occupied around 67% of seats in mission colleges. But even this did not produce desired result in conversion, because conversion among Brahmins were very few. He also asserted that these educated Brahmins not only do not accept Christ, but became bitter opponents of Christianity. His personal experience during the stay at Madras Christian College in April 1888 reinforced this position. He witnessed a protest by Hindu students when a Brahmin boy wanted to be baptized. After a few years of unrest and pressure, the boy gave in and renounced his intention to be baptized. So, in the first article, he says emphatically, and I quote, Christianity has no more pronounced force in India today than many of the Brahmins who were indebted for their education to Christian liberality. The men who are organizing Hindu tract societies and endeavoring in every possible way to promote an anti-Christian renaissance of Hindu thought and feeling have in numberless instances graduated from the missionary college. He argued that if the apostles had spent all their energy and resources converting Pharisees of Judea, Christianity would not have spread everywhere. He wanted Indian mission to adopt the strategy of Jesus, that is, good news to the poor. So he concluded in his article by saying, and I quote, let them devote the money now expended in higher education partly to primary schools for the masses of the people and partly to the development of native agencies. Let them send their best men to the work of preaching the gospel. In a word, let them try democratic methods. Loon contrasted the educational mission with evangelism. He urged all the mission agencies to recognize the failure of Duff's policy and to adopt the apostolic method. Loon concluded that missionary, and I quote again, the missionary higher education, though rendering a great service to Brahmins and aiding greatly in their intellectual development, was not policy of was not evangelistic in any real sense and was not even intended as such by those who carried it on. Now, to all these accusations, missionaries responded, and this was their defense. The reaction of the missionaries in India to the articles was immediate. The June 1889 issue of the Harvest Field, the official journal of Indian Wesleyan Mission in Mysore district, was devoted entirely to responding to these charges. The editorial described the articles as reckless criticism and a series of wild misstatements. Many of the missionaries on education mission responded to the allegation. Dr. William Miller, then principal of Madras Christian College, wrote that, and I quote, the Christian education is not a substitute for, but a supplement and support to the work of evangelism of masses. The two kinds of work are the necessary complements of one another. He also demonstrated that many of the allegations were misleading the public and showed that the author's short and superficial acquaintance with India. W.H. Finlay, another Wesleyan missionary, defended the educational mission by saying that if Christian education led a ceremonial Hindu to demand a more spiritual religion to satisfy him, it was not a failure, but a success of the mission. Broadly speaking, the defense of the educational work of missionaries could be categorized under the following heads. One, education is integral part of the mission endeavors. The common refrain of all the defenders was that evangelism should not be separated from education. Pitting one against the other gives the impression that they are mutually exclusive. In fact, they are not. Educational institution gave missionaries the opportunity to interact with young men in a very different environment from the street preaching or other traditional evangelistic method. It shaped young minds and prepared them to think about religion in a logical way. For both Miller and Finlay, who espoused the fulfillment theology that Christianity was the fulfillment of Hinduism, this was the right direction for any mission to take. Miller pointed out that Duff's policy of Christian education was not the result of a rash 6-week investigation by a 24-year-old impulsive young man, but was the result of mature deliberation by the church whose missionary he was. Over the subsequent 50 years, this policy won the approval of all major Protestant mission societies, In 1879, just a decade before this controversy, the South India Missionary Conference, attended by the representatives of all the Protestant missionary societies, unanimously passed a resolution affirming the value of high class Christian education as a missionary agency. A clear explanation of what this means for the British public who were footing the bill came from Finlay. He said that they were seeing a transformation in Hinduism itself because of the educational policy. And Christian education has led Hindus to value religion, have a Christian ideal of what a religion should be. He believed that this was the first step for an educated Hindu who would then accept Christianity as a practical solution to his spiritual awakening and yearning. He used the metaphor of Christ as a new wine being poured into the wineskin of Hinduism, leading to the eventual bursting of that wineskin. Now, the following incident explains his method clearly. And I quote from one of his articles. A Brahmin youth takes up Thomas a Kempis in my drawing room and scans it, admires it, but puts it down, saying, "We have all that in our religion." When I hear this, I reply, "Very well, I don't care to dispute that point. You think that Hinduism teaches these truths and will enable you to live by them? Try it by all means. Only if it fails you, come back to me for a better guide and a stronger power." So, according to his theology, he had great confidence. Even an enlightened Hindu will ultimately accept Christ because they cannot live a righteous life without the power of Christ. For the missionaries involved, education not only prepared the hearts and minds of the next generation and planted the seeds of gospel, but also kept the door open for future conversation about religion and morality. So this is not quick as evangelistic conversion, but it's a long but a solid strategy which will eventually bear fruit. Now the second was education for all. Loon claimed that a disproportionate amount of missionary time and energy was spent on educating the Hindu aristocracy, that evangelism to the masses had become subordinate to education. The missionaries disputed this claim, saying that it misrepresented the real statistics. William Miller argued that statistically, out of 264 foreign missionaries from various Protestant missions in South India, only 40 were engaged in full time educational work, and they too did not neglect preaching and evangelism. Another minister, Hudson, refuted the claim that missionaries spent a lot of time on secular teaching, saying that missionaries devoted their time to teaching few popular subjects like literature and religion to keep their influence on the people, leaving the rest to qualified teaching assistants who had been developed through missionary education. Now, in this point, my mother pointed out after reading this, when she was a teacher in a mission school, when she joined in 1980s, there were at least half of the staff were Brahmin staffs. But she was telling they were all product of the mission schools, and they were, though they were religiously Hindus, still they were committed to the Christian cause. And only later, when Christians became more educated, those vacancies were filled by Christian teachers. So it took a lot of time, but still it happened. The missionaries tried to dispel the image that they gave priority to educating Brahmins and neglected the improvement of native Christians. They reiterated that the mission schools give all students the opportunity to study, but because of their intellectual background, Brahmins naturally send their children to missionary schools and colleges for English education, and they progress well. This can be seen from the statistics given by another missionary, James Schooling of Wesleyan College, Rayapat in Chennai. This college was for girls. In the missionary girls' secondary school in Chennai Presidency, there were 2,127 native Christian girls compared to 226 Brahmins. But With boys, it's completely, opposite. So this statistics proves that, Brahmins were happy to send their children, sons, but culturally they do not want girls to be educated. But their So the cultural phenomena is also there. They were bright, they had an intellectual background, and they were, sending the children to mission schools to learn English. In fact, the missionaries are trying to increase the number of native Christians. Um, J.A. Vance argues that missionaries are continually looking out for Christians who display the slightest indications of mental ability or aptitude for study. And however poor these youths may be, yet in our much abused high schools, they have always been able, as free scholars, to have a first class education along with the best of the Brahmins. Now, this also talks about the standard they had. They didn't simply pick anyone for higher education because they are Christian. They had, certain criteria. They need to pass certain exams. Then only they can, enter into the higher education system. And missionaries, they were trying their best to, equip everyone. And it should not be forgotten that there were many boarding establishments which provided free accommodation for native Christians who wanted to further their education. In this way, the missionaries wanted to show that education was available to all, regardless of caste, and that this social situation would improve over time. Now we are coming to the contemporary evaluation. Maybe now looking at that issue after 130 odd years, how do we see that? Now, after 135 years, the situation in India has changed completely. But most of these educational institutions still stand as a testimony to the investment made by the missionary societies and the sacrifice made by the missionaries. Many generations have passed through and benefited from these institutions in Nagapattinam district. Now it's part of Trichy, Tanjore, Diocese of Church of South India. Personally, I am a product of these institutions from my primary school to college. Only now my studies at Durham, if you can call that as a secular university, that's the only secular place I am in now. My parents worked in a missionary school named after Reverend Finlay. I can personally testify to the impact of these institutions established by Wesleyan missionaries on both Christians and non-Christians alike. First, although the legacy of educational mission in terms of Dalit liberation, that is the Dalits are the low caste in the Indian hierarchy, could be debated and questioned by Dalit theologians. These institutions are a blessing in disguise for contemporary Indian Christianity because they provide social capital for Christians who are still a minority within the Indian society. Now, these institutions helped Christianity to take root in the local communities, just like how coffee morning helped in Isle of Man. The social capital provided by these institutions make Christianity a force to reckon with. Without these institutions, Christianity would be dismissed in the context of the rise of Hindu nationalism. If the missionaries had provided education only for Christians without being inclusive, or if they had focused only on evangelism and neglected education and medical work, Christian community in India might have become sectarian, exclusive, inward-looking group without much influence in the broader society. Secondly, these higher education institutions may have failed in their initial perceived goal of converting all the students who set foot on their campuses, but they have instilled Christian culture and values in the countless students who have gone on to defend Christian values in Indian society. It is difficult to measure this impact, but there are countless stories of old students whose lives have been transformed by the education provided by these institutions. At local level, these students continue to support their alma mater in all circumstances. And thirdly, there are few research on higher education in Tamil Nadu, written by Hindus, the state where I come from. One research, it concludes the present landscape of higher education owes much to the Christian missionary enterprise, and said that their, I quote, their establishment of educational institutions, promotion of inclusive education, provision of quality education with global exposure, and engagement in social service have had a profound impact on the state's educational development and overall societal progress. In 2018, an article was published by a few statisticians showing the presence of higher education institution of Catholic churches in different geographical location had shown, had increased human capital and GDP of that area over a century. Over a century, they made some statistical analysis. And if a similar statistical analysis is carried out on their districts where Wesleyan Methodist missionaries worked, I'm confident that we will see the same story repeated. Now, conclusion. The missionary controversy of 1889-90 challenged the most cherished method of all the mission societies, that is the education. But the controversy also provided an opportunity for the Wesleyan Missionary Society to reassess its priorities and chart a course for the next century. When Finlay took over the reins of WMS as one of its secretaries from 1900 to 1910, this controversy and the debates about the issues in the mission field guided its policies. As a whole, the missionaries were vindicated in their policy of running the educational institutions, and this controversy gave a greater certainty to that policy. As I have argued, from a contemporary perspective, Christianity would not have had the social capital in Indian society had it not been for these institutions, which dotted almost all the towns and cities of India, and through which a whole generation was shaped through education. Thank you.